Now the coins that they show here include a turtle from Aegina. It's got a turtle on one side and the triangle indentation marking looking things. Then a coin from Syracuse that has 4 horses or deer. Then an Antimachus of Bactria, and there's more. The rule of Pisistratids is our best known example of early Greek tyranny, but like the tyrannies of Sicyon, Corinth, and elsewhere, it eventually fell. Hipparchus was murdered in 514 by 2 young nobles, Harmodius and Aristogeiton, for purely private reasons. After this event, Hippias became more ruthless. The Alcmaeonids secured the support of the Oracle of Delphi, which in turn urged the Spartans to root out the Athenian tyranny. Sparta, as we shall see shortly, had become the greatest military power of Greece, and its great king, Cleisthenes, was more than eager to do the bidding of Apollo. In 510 he led an army north across the Isthmus of Corinth and forced the abdication of Hippias, who went into exile at the Persian court. Now, a bit about Cleisthenes and democracy. The birth of democracy, ladies and gentlemen, here we are. Once the tyrant and his mercenary army had been removed, Athens fell once more into dissension. But the basic situation was now far different than it had been earlier in the century. The power of the state had been exalted by the Pisistratids and at the expense of the local loyalties and the clan ties. Non-noble social and economic groups had gained a sense of independence. When Isagoras, a noble preferred by Sparta, set up a new oligarchy, his effort to turn back the clock shattered. Rival Athenian leader Cleisthenes of the Alcmaeonid family gained power in 508 with wide popular support. Although King Cleisthenes himself came back, and that might be Cleisthenes, came back himself with a small Spartan force to restore the situation, it was in vain. Here is the birth of democracy, ladies and gentlemen. Quote, "The populace of Athens rose and besieged the Spartans on the Acropolis until they agreed to retire." So the Acropolis is the safe place at the center of the city where the Spartans went to say they were going to reestablish rule over Athens. And they were put under arrest for all intents and purposes. Now, that for all intents and purposes seemed like a narrow escape. It seemed like a major event, a world-changing event, sort of, for them. It was a pretty big deal. They got the Spartans to leave Sparta, which had been the hegemonic state of Greece for well over a century at this point. And they got them to leave the situation alone. Quote, "Cleisthenes then recast the political machinery of Athens in a mold which proved basically satisfactory over the next 2.5 centuries. Cleisthenes is in power, gets power by political support of the people, doesn't gain it by power the way the Spartans tried, and recast the political machinery of Athens with support of the people after this crisis when thinking's fresh and people are supporting thinking. Recast it in a mold that was satisfactory for 250 years. Essentially, his aims were first to break the power of local social units in favor of the state as a whole, a process which had been going on since Draco first brought homicide under state jurisdiction. I mentioned we would see just a bit more about anarchy. There was a point when murder was not the state's business, so he murdered somebody else. You know, that's up to his family to get the guy back or whatever. Not the state's business. The definition of the state, in my opinion, could be something like that institution which guarantees rights. So we could say the state was born when rights were first protected. Draco first brought murder under the jurisdiction of the state. Up until a certain point it was not under the jurisdiction of the state. So this is a process that started with him doing that. He started by asserting the power and saying a person murdering another person may or may not get away with it. We're going to do our best to see that situations where justice has been impinged are corrected. Quote, And secondly, to lodge the essential power of the state in the hands of the people. Whether Cleisthenes had an idealistic predisposition towards democracy may be doubted. Right? Maybe he was just riding the wave of power, and he said, power to the people? And everyone's like, yay! And he's like, yeah, power to the people, yep. Who knows? Who knows? That might be obvious upon further readings. Reading the situation more in depth, I've never come across an exact reading of it, but if you looked into the original accounts, it might be that they skip over obvious things. Who knows? I don't know. That's something to look into. Did Cleisthenes have an idealistic fervor for democracy? Or did he just institute it because he was there lusting for power? It says we can doubt that he had an idealistic predisposition. Quote, but the exigencies of practical politics at the time led him to the court, and to court the support of the populace, and so to exalt its role. Therefore, to exalt the role of the populace. Henceforth, the building blocks of Athenian political life were the small territorial units called the demes, D-E-M-E-S, eventually about 170 in number. It's quite a few. Started out with less. The citizens were those people registered on the rolls of the demes. So you had your local deme. In America it's a state, then there's counties. In England, what do they have? Shires and all kinds of stuff. I don't know if they still have shires. Cleisthenes seems to have gone farther than the Pisistrates in admitting many of the foreigners as residents in Athens to citizenship at this time. So sort of mass amnesty. The demes had some power of local self-government. For purposes of general elections, their residents were grouped into 10 new tribes. To ensure, however, that each tribe or electoral district reflected all of Attica, rather than local interests, a tribe consisted of demes located in 3 different areas. So it would have 3 districts, one in the countryside, one in the city itself, and one over on the coast. Quote, one or more demes from each area formed a tritis, T-R-I-T-T-Y-S, and 3 tritius made up a tribe. This complicated grouping attests the advance in political thinking which had taken place in Greek constitutional thought and admirably fulfilled its purpose of organizing the citizens on a public rather than a social base. The older units, phratries and the like, continued to exist but operated primarily as social and religious entities. Okay, at this point we're going to interrupt Starr, History of the Ancient World, and we're going to go back to Botsford and Robinson, Hellenic History, because there's a bit in here that I want to get and sort of interweave it just after we've mentioned a few things in there while it's fresh in our mind. So I'm going to start on page 79, and we're talking about Athens and the triumph of democracy. This is the second page of the chapter. And he mentions here that aristocracy of birth. You remember we talked about how Athens said people who make 500 bushels of produce per year are in this class, and 300 in this class, and 100 in this class. So he's talking about that here, and he says aristocracy of birth is now yielding some of its power to wealth. So the aristocracy of birth that had the power before is giving some of it away to people who are earning it by other means. Is that true? Are they yielding their power to wealth? I mean, in a certain sense, but let's not make them actively doing that, because I don't think they were actively doing it. I think it was just a culture that valued productivity. So, Marxist reading of it there. Keep your eye out for just little teeny bits of Marxism sneak in here and there, and it's hard to tell. Hard to tell sometimes. Now remember, the reason that they had to reorganize Athens and the reason they were doing all this stuff is because of constant turmoil and disorder. So we skip down a bit here. Quote, the dissatisfaction with their lot made the Athenian populace fertile soil for a tyranny. And about the year 632 BC, a powerful noble named Cylon, with his help of his father-in-law, Theagenes, tyrant of Megara, seized the Acropolis and attempted to make himself tyrant. But the heavy infantry, gathering from the countryside, besieged the conspirators, until finally they took refuge at the great altar of